So today we're doing array2 mod3, and given an array of integers, we want to return true if the array contains either 3 even or 3 odd values next to each other. So so in this video there are really two ways I'm gonna try to approach the problem. One way will be a little longer, and then we're going to optimize the solution. So for this one here, so we need a for loop to look at each element, and then of course to look at the next two elements to judge whether those two elements are in fact even or odd. The emphasis is on looking on the next two elements, right? Don't forget that little part about looking over to the next two elements, because we're going to actually have to readjust our for loop parameter to sort of represent not walking off the edge of the array. So first and foremost, int I is equal to 0, right? I is less than nums.length, increment I by 1. And so now we're inside the for loop. So a common metric to judge whether or not a number is even or odd is to say that if that number modulus 2 equals to 0, then it's odd. Oh, sorry, then it's even. Or if that number modulus 2 does not equal to 0, then it's odd. And so that's sort of the common way of judging whether or not a number is odd or even. So if nums of I, which is of course any given element on any given iteration, does not equal, or rather modulus 2 equals 0, then that number is even. And so we're at an even number. So now we're supposing that the for loop has sort of caught an even number. So if we are in fact at an even number, and nums of I plus 1 is modulus 2, if that number is even, so if nums of I is even and the number next to it is even, then we'll go inside the the if statement, and we'll sort of increment I by 2, and we'll judge if that number is modulus 2 is equal to 0. And of course, if it is, we'll return true. So essentially what this is saying is, if we're in fact at a number which is even, let's say this number, and the next number is even, which it's not, so we won't go inside this if statement. But if we're here, if this number is even and the next number is even, right, that's what we have in our parameter here, then we'll increment I by 2. So we were here and we checked if the next, well, we were here and we checked if the next number was even. And if it is, then we'll increment I by 2. And so now we're here and we're checking if that's even. If that's even, we'll return true. Otherwise, after the for loop, we'll return false. Now that's just one scenario if the number is even. However, if in fact nums of I modulus 2 does not equal 0, and nums of I modulus 2 that is of course the next element. If modulus 2 that does not equal to 0, then essentially we will do the same process. So the number, so any given number on any given iteration, if that number is odd, then we'll increment nums of I by 1, but not actually, we're just checking that element, and we're just checking whether or not that 2 is odd. And if it's odd, then we'll increment by 2, and we'll check if that number is equal to, if that number modulus 2 is not equal to 0, then we'll return true. Otherwise, if it wasn't set to true in both cases, then no such pattern exists where we have 3 numbers next to each other, and in which case we'll just return false. And another thing you want to remember is that since we are in fact incrementing by 2, we actually want to ensure that we don't walk off the edge of the array. And you'll see that we have all greens. Now, this is sort of inefficient code in this case. You can combine this into the parameter. So what I mean by that, and I'll have to zoom out a bit, but what I mean by that is you can say, okay, if nums of I modulus 2 is equal to 0 and nums of I plus 1 modulus 2 is equal to 0, and then you can say, and nums of I modulus nums of I plus 2 modulus 2 is equal to 0. And then you don't really have to have all of this stuff. You could just return true in that case. Otherwise, if nums of I modulus 2, so you don't, again, we don't really need all this stuff. If we just merge that last, sort of that last condition into the parameter itself. So we'll say, and nums of I plus 2 modulus 2 is equal to, does not equal to 0. Then we'll also return true. And that should, let's see here. Yeah, that should be fine.